The wheat was almost ready when the sky broke open. Cale saw it first because he was the only one looking up. 12 years old, knees caked with the red dirt of Thessaly 4, hands wrapped around an irrigation coupling that his mother had asked him to fix before supper. He'd been distracted, watching a flock of steplarks wheel against the late afternoon sun, counting their turns the way he counted everything out of habit when the light changed. Not dimmed. Changed. Like someone had pressed a thumb over the color of the world and smeared it sideways. Then the ships came through. They didn't descend so much as materialize. Vast, angular structures of black chitin and bioluminescent veining, like the carapaces of insects scaled to the size of mountains. 12 of them, arranged in a formation that looked ceremonial even before anyone understood what the ceremony was. They blotted out the sun over the Thessaly Valley in a shadow so total that the temperature dropped 6 degrees in 90 seconds, and the wheat 2 weeks from harvest, the best yield in 7 seasons, began to curl inward, confused by the sudden dark. Cale's mother, Sira, found him still holding the coupling. She pulled him to his feet without a word, and he could feel the tremor in her hands. Not panic, something worse, recognition. She'd seen ships like these before. The colony horn sounded 3 long blasts, the signal that hadn't been used since the Scaran border raids 11 years ago, back when Cale was still nursing, and the colony was still young enough to believe that being far from everything meant being safe from everything. People emerged from homesteads and workshops, and the long communal barn where Delgado kept his seed stores, all of them shading their eyes against the strange half-light, all of them stopping when they saw the sky. Families gathered their children without being told. The young twins, 8 years old, ran to their father's side with the instinct of small animals sensing weather. Maria Santos dropped the hydropump she'd been repairing and stood there with her hands empty and her face very still. Pavel Orozco came out of the equipment shed with a socket wrench in one hand, looked up, and slowly set the wrench down on the ground like it had become irrelevant, which it had. Old Harlan was the first one to say the word. Verath. He said it the way you'd say the name of a disease. Standing on the porch of his workshop, hands black with machine grease, 73 years old and built like a fence post that had survived too many winters. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who had been waiting for bad news for a long time and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Everybody get to the common, Sira said, and her voice carried because it always carried. She'd been the colony's informal leader for 6 years, not because anyone had voted, but because when she spoke, things made sense. She had a way of standing that was its own argument, shoulders level, chin steady, hands open at her sides. Bring the children, don't bring weapons. The hell we won't, said Tomás Varga from across the square, already holding a pulse rifle he'd pulled from under his tractor seat. Tomás was compact, dense with muscle, a man whose body had been shaped by labor the way water shapes rock. He'd been a soldier once, a lifetime and a half-dozen worlds ago, and the soldier in him never fully went to sleep. It just dozed with one eye open. Sira looked at him, just looked. Tomás was a good man, a hard worker, father of 3. He'd fought in the fringe conflicts before settling on Thessaly. He knew what a gun could do. Tomás, she said, they have 12 capital ships in our sky. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be ash. They want something else. Put it down. He put it down, but the way he did it, laying the rifle across the tractor seat, barrel pointed toward the field, hand lingering on the stock, said he knew exactly how far away it was and how quickly he could pick it up again. The Verath landed a single shuttle in the middle of the wheat field, and Cale hated them for that before he hated them for anything else. The landing thrusters scorched a perfect circle into the crop, 40 meters of grain that his mother and Delgado and the Yun family had spent months tending, gone in the time it took to draw a breath. The smell of burnt wheat filled the valley, sweet and wrong, and Cale watched the smoke rise and thought of every morning he'd spent walking the rows with his mother, checking the moisture levels, pulling weeds, learning the names of the pests and the rhythms of the soil. All of that care, all of that time, turned into a black circle of ash that the evening breeze was already beginning to scatter. The shuttle opened like a wound, and they walked out. Cale had seen pictures of Verath in his mother's old military database, the one she thought she'd hidden well enough that a curious 12-year-old wouldn't find it. He'd found it at 9, cracked the encryption at 10. It wasn't good encryption, and his mother, for all her tactical brilliance, had used his birthday as the password, and spent 6 months reading every entry before guilt made him confess, and Sira, to her credit, hadn't been angry. She'd been quiet for a long time, and then she'd sat down beside him and answered every question he had, which took most of the night. The pictures hadn't prepared him. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies encased in segmented exoskeletal plating that wasn't armor, it was them. Chitinous dark, shot through with ridges of bioluminescence that pulsed in patterns Cale's brain tried to read as language and couldn't. Their heads were elongated smooth, with compound eyes that refracted light into fractured rainbows, and when they moved wrong, too fluid for something with an exoskeleton, as if the joints didn't exist in the places you expected. They had a quality of wrongness that went deeper than appearance, as though the universe had made them following a different set of instructions, and the result worked perfectly but rhymed with nothing in human experience. 8 of them came out first. Soldiers, clearly. They carried weapons that looked grown rather than manufactured, organic curves of hardened resin that pulsed with the same light as their bodies. They fanned out in a formation that covered every angle of the commons without seeming to try. Then the Emperor came. Vrethkai was larger than the others by a full half-meter, and his exoskeleton was different, layered, ancient-looking, the bioluminescent patterns so dense they seemed to shimmer like oil on water. He wore no additional ornamentation because he didn't need any. Everything about him said apex. Everything about him said end. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a being who had never encountered a situation he couldn't control, and when he stopped walking, the air around him seemed to settle differently, as though even gravity was paying attention. Behind him, 4 attendants carried something on a hovering platform. It was a hammer. Even the word felt wrong for it. It was a weapon from a mythology that wasn't human, a massive block of dark metal, veined with the same bioluminescence, mounted on a haft that was taller than any man in the colony. It hummed. Cale could feel it in his back teeth, a subsonic vibration that made his vision swim if he looked at it too long. The air around it bent, not visibly, but perceptibly, like heat shimmer on a summer road, a distortion that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with mass. 500 tons of whatever the Verath used instead of steel, compressed into a shape that looked simple and was anything but. Vrethkai stopped at the edge of the commons and surveyed the humans the way you'd survey a crop, not with malice, but with a kind of clinical assessment of yield. When he spoke, it was through a translation device embedded in his thorax, and the voice that came out was almost human, almost warm and entirely wrong, like a melody played on an instrument built for a different kind of music. People of this world, I am Vrethkai, Ascendant Emperor of the Verath Dominion. Your settlement exists within territory now claimed by the Dominion under the writ of expansion. This is not a negotiation. Silence from the colonists. 312 people standing in the commons, holding their children, watching their sky. The Dominion does not destroy. The Dominion absorbs. Your lives, your structures, your labor, all will continue. You will serve. But the terms of service are determined by a single truth. He gestured, and the attendants brought the platform forward. The hammer's hum deepened, and several colonists took an involuntary step back. Cale didn't. He was too busy watching the light. The hammer of Vreth, 500 standard tons, forged in the neutron collapse of Keth Prime. Every species the Dominion has absorbed has been offered this trial. Lift the hammer and your people are granted the status of honored vassal, self-governance, cultural preservation, a seat in the advisory chamber. Fail and you are classified as a labor species. No rights, no voice, no appeal. He paused, and his compound eyes swept the crowd with something that might have been amusement. No species has ever lifted it. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Cale had ever heard. It had texture, the silence of 300 people doing the same math at the same time and arriving at the same answer. Harlan broke it. He stepped forward, limping on the knee that had never healed right after Verata Minor, and looked up at Vrethkai with an expression that Cale would spend years trying to name. Not defiance, not submission, something in between, the look of a man measuring the distance between what he wanted and what was possible and finding it very, very far. How many attempts? Harlan asked. Vrethkai tilted his great head. As many as you wish. Every member of your settlement may try. When all have failed, the classification is final. And if nobody tries, then you have chosen labor. The result is the same. Harlan nodded, slow, like he was chewing something that tasted bad. He turned back to the colonists and found Sierra's eyes. Something passed between them, the kind of communication that people develop when they've survived enough together that language becomes optional. Then he turned back toward the hammer. Might as well start with me then. Sierra caught his arm. Harlan. I'm 73 years old, Sierra. I've got a bad knee, a worse back, and I haven't slept through the night since the war. What exactly am I saving myself for? He said it with a half-smile, the same half-smile he used when something broke in the workshop, and he had to fix it with the wrong tools. The smile that said this is going to hurt, and I'm going to do it anyway, and I might as well find it funny because the alternative is worse. He walked to the hammer. Up close, the thing was obscene. The head alone was the size of a ground transport, and the metal, if it was metal, seemed to absorb light, pulling the colors of the sunset into itself and giving back nothing. The haft was smooth, featureless, and when Harlan wrapped his hands around it, the bioluminescent veins flared once, a pulse that traveled up the length of the weapon and vanished into the head. Harlan set his feet, squared his shoulders, pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled harder. The tendons in his neck stood out like cables. His face went red, then white. A vein throbbed at his temple. His bad knee buckled, and Tamaz Varga and Jin Yun rushed forward to catch him before he hit the ground. Harlan sat in the dirt for a moment, breathing hard, and then he laughed, a short, dry sound like a cough with a sense of humor. Heavier than it looks, he said to no one in particular, and let them help him up. Vrethkai watched with the patience of geology. Tamaz tried next. He was 41, broad-shouldered, the strongest man in the colony by any physical measure. He'd once carried a disabled harvester engine 2 kilometers on his back when the transport broke down, 400 kilograms, through summer heat, up a ridge, without stopping. When he gripped the hammer, his hands looked right on it, proportional, and for one breath the colonists dared to hope. He heaved with everything he had. The hammer didn't move. It didn't even vibrate. It sat on its platform like it was bolted to the core of the planet, and Tamaz strained against it until something in his shoulder made a sound like a branch breaking, and he staggered back, gasping, his right arm hanging wrong. His wife, Renata, ran to him, and he waved her off with his good arm, his face twisted not with pain but with the particular shame of a strong man who has just been shown that strength is not enough. One by one they tried. Jin Yun, wiry and methodical, approaching the hammer like a puzzle, trying different grips, different stances, different angles of leverage. Delgado, 60 years old and quiet, who gripped the haft with farmers' hands that had worked soil on 3 worlds, and pulled with a patience that had nothing to do with force. Maria Santos, who'd been a combat engineer and understood leverage better than anyone. She brought tools, braces, a fulcrum improvised from a tractor jack, and was politely informed by the Verath attendants that only direct biological contact was permitted. Pavel Orozco was 22, and convinced that youth and fury would be enough. He attacked the hammer with a shout, gripping and pulling and refusing to stop even when his palms began to blister, and his arms shook so badly that sweat flew from his elbows. He held on for nearly a minute, longer than anyone, and when he finally let go, he collapsed to his hands and knees and vomited into the dirt, and nobody looked away because they all understood that he had given everything and it wasn't enough. The Becker twins tried together, 4 hands on the haft, pulling in synchronized desperation. They were the colony's best team. They finished each other's sentences, moved in unconscious coordination, worked together like 2 halves of the same thought. Together they strained against the hammer until the tendons in their forearms bulged, and their faces contorted into masks of identical effort. And together they failed, and they sat down in the dirt side by side with the same expression of blank exhaustion, mirror images of defeat. Renata Varga tried, even though she was slight and soft-spoken and had never claimed to be strong. She walked to the hammer with the deliberate calm of a woman who had decided that failure was acceptable but not trying was not. She gripped the haft, closed her eyes, and pulled with a quiet intensity that somehow felt different from the brute force that had come before, more focused, more internal, as though she was trying to move the hammer with her will rather than her muscles. The veins pulsed their responsive pattern, and the hammer didn't move, and Renata opened her eyes and nodded once, as though confirming something she'd already suspected, and walked back to her husband. Dr. Akafer tried, the colony's only physician, a tall woman with steady hands and a mind that worked in systems. She examined the haft before touching it, running her fingers along the surface, feeling the vibrations, cataloging data. When she gripped it and pulled, she was watching the bioluminescent response rather than focusing on the lift itself, and she lasted only seconds before the resistance drove her back. But she walked away slowly, her eyes distant, her fingers tapping against her thigh in a rhythm that said she was processing, categorizing, filing information she didn't yet have a use for. Even Delgado's grandson tried, 14 years old, lanky, all elbows and adolescent pride. He attacked the hammer with the reckless confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned that the universe doesn't care about enthusiasm, and he bounced off it like it was a wall, landing on his back in the dirt with a startled grunt that drew nervous laughter from the crowd. His grandfather helped him up and said something quiet in his ear, and the boy nodded and didn't cry, though his eyes were bright, and his jaw was set in the particular way of teenagers pretending to be older than they are. Cale watched from the edge of the crowd, and he watched the Verath watching the humans, and he saw something that the adults were too focused to notice. Each time a human gripped the hammer, the bioluminescent pulse traveled up the haft in a specific pattern, a cascade of light that started at the point of contact and raced upward into the head. And each time the human strained and failed, the pattern intensified, brighter, faster, more agitated. The harder they tried, the brighter it glowed. He watched it through 17 attempts, counting the pulses, timing the intervals, the way he counted step larks and timed the irrigation cycles, and tracked the weather patterns that nobody had asked him to track, but that he tracked anyway because his brain did that. It collected patterns the way other people collected tools. The hammer wasn't just heavy. The hammer was listening. By the time the sun had fully set, a sun they could see again now, below the bellies of the ships, 37 colonists had tried and failed. Some were injured. Tamaz was sitting against the barn wall with his shoulder wrapped, his face blank with pain and something worse than pain. The colonists had the look of people watching a door close, slowly, inevitably, with the full understanding that once it closed, it wasn't opening again. Cale found his mother. She was standing at the edge of the commons, arms crossed, watching the hammer with the expression she used when she was running calculations in her head, the narrow-eyed, slightly unfocused look that meant she was somewhere deep inside her own mind, turning a problem over and over, looking for the edge where it came apart. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you something about the hammer." She looked down at him. In the residual light of the Verath ships and the thin moonlight of Thessaly's two moons, her face was half shadow, half silver. "I've been watching," he said. "The light patterns change when people touch it. They respond to whoever's gripping it. They get stronger when the person pushes harder. It's a feedback system, Mom. Bioneural, like the stuff in Harlan's Verath files. The hammer reads the person, and the harder the person fights it, the harder it fights back." Sira was quiet for a long time. Her eyes moved from Kale to the hammer and back. "You think it's adaptive resistance?" "I think it matches whatever you bring to it and then adds more. That's why nobody can lift it. They keep sending the strongest people, the ones with the most force, the most will, the most fight. And the hammer takes all of that and turns it into weight." "So what beats it?" Kale swallowed. "I think nothing beats it. I think that's the point. I think you have to not try to beat it." Before Sira could respond, Vrethkai raised one segmented arm. "You may continue at dawn. The trial extends until every willing member of your settlement has attempted the lift. When no one remains, the classification." "I'll try." The voice was thin and clear, and came from the wrong part of the crowd, too low, too young. Kale stepped forward. Sira's hand caught his shoulder, and her grip was iron. "No." "Mom." "Absolutely not." "Mom, I told you it's not about strength. When they grip it, the hammer reads their aggression, their fear, their need to win. It matches all of it. Every adult who touched it went in fighting, and the hammer fought back harder. But if someone goes in without fighting..." "You are 12 years old. You weigh 41 kilograms. You are not touching that thing." "That's exactly why it might work. I'm 12. I don't have what the hammer is looking for. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a fighter. I'm not trying to save the colony or prove anything or beat the aliens. I just want to know what it feels like." "You want to?" Sira stopped, stared at him, and Kale watched the calculation happen in her eyes, the tactical analyst surfacing under the mother, running the variables, weighing the probabilities, arriving at a conclusion that the mother didn't want to hear. Vrethkai had turned to look, and the compound eyes found Kale with a precision that made the boy's skin crawl. The Emperor studied him the way an entomologist studies a specimen, with interest, but no expectation of significance. "He's just a child," Vrethkai said, and the translation device rendered his tone in a way that might have been amusement, or might have been contempt, or might have been something the human language didn't have a word for. "He's just a child," the Emperor said again, and this time it was clearly a sneer, the elongated head tilting, the mandibles clicking in a rhythm the soldiers echoed, a sound like dry laughter that traveled through the Verath formation like a wave. The Verath soldiers shifted. One of them made a gesture that needed no translation, dismissal, derision, the universal language of "don't waste our time." Kale looked up at his mother. Sira was looking at him the way she sometimes looked at the horizon before a storm, measuring, calculating, searching for something she needed to find before the weather hit. She'd been a tactical analyst before the colony, before Thessaly, before Kale. She'd spent 12 years in service, and she'd learned to read situations the way some people read books, not just the words, but the spaces between them. "Harlan," she said without looking away from her son, "you were at Verada Minor. You've seen Verath technology up close. Bioneural adaptive systems is what he's describing possible." Harlan had come closer, listening. His face had changed while Kale was talking, the weathered resignation giving way to something sharper, more alert, the look of a man whose mind was working again after a long period of disuse. "Verath tech is bioneural. Everything they build is alive or close to it. Their weapons, their ships, their infrastructure, it's all responsive, adaptive. It reads biological input and adjusts." He looked at the hammer, then at Kale. "I saw it at Verada Minor. Their fortifications would strengthen in response to whatever weapon we used against them. Hit them with kinetics, they'd harden. Hit them with energy weapons they'd absorb and redirect. The harder you attacked, the stronger they got. And if you didn't attack? Harlan was quiet for a beat. There was a moment, end of the second day. We were pinned, exhausted, out of ammunition. Corporal Tanaka walked up to one of their barriers, just walked up to it, unarmed, no aggression, just tired and lost and looking for a way through. And the barrier, he stopped. The barrier thinned, just for a second, like it didn't know what to do with her. Sierra closed her eyes, opened them. "Go," she said. Cale walked toward the hammer. The crowd parted for him, not because they believed, but because they didn't know what else to do. 300 people watching a skinny 12-year-old in dirt-stained coveralls walk toward a weapon that had broken every adult who'd touched it. Some of them looked away. Maria Santos was crying, silently, the tears cutting lines through the dust on her face. Pavel Orozco, still pale from his own attempt, watched with an expression that mixed skepticism and desperate hope in equal measure. Vrethkai watched with those compound eyes, and Cale could feel the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, millions of lenses, each one capturing a different angle, assembling a picture of this small human from 1,000 fragmented perspectives. "You permit your young to be humiliated?" Vrethkai asked, addressing Sierra. "I permit my son to try," she replied. The Emperor's mandibles clicked. Not laughter this time, something else. Cale reached the platform. The hammer loomed above him, and up close the subsonic hum was stronger. He could feel it in his chest, in his lungs, a vibration that wanted to become dread. The bioluminescent veins pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, and Cale realized with a start that the rhythm was matching his heartbeat. It was already reading him. He stood there for a moment and didn't touch it. He breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way his mother had taught him during the storms, the electrical storms that rolled through the Thessaly Valley every spring, when the sky turned green and the air tasted like copper. And Cale had been so afraid the first time that he'd hidden under his bed and cried until his chest hurt. Sierra had found him there. She hadn't said "don't be afraid," because Sierra never said things that weren't true. She'd lain down on the floor beside him under the bed in the dark, and she'd put her hand on his back and she'd said, "Fear is just a signal. It's your body telling you to pay attention. You don't have to obey it. You just have to hear it." And then she'd hummed. A song without words, low and steady, something she said her grandmother had hummed to her, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. A melody passed down through so many generations that nobody remembered who'd written it or what it was about, only that it was the sound of someone telling you that you weren't alone. Cale heard the fear now. His heart was hammering, ironic, he thought, and almost laughed, and his hands were shaking, and every intelligent part of his brain was screaming that this was a 500-ton alien weapon, and he was a boy who couldn't bench press his own body weight. But there was another part of his brain, the part that had taken apart Harlan's broken harvester at age 8, not because he thought he could fix it, but because he wanted to see how it worked. The part that had climbed the communication tower on a dare and spent 20 minutes at the top, not scared, not proud, just looking at the valley and thinking how strange it was that the world looked different from up high. The part that had found his mother's military database and read every entry not because he wanted to be a soldier, but because he wanted to understand. The part that collected patterns and counted larks and tracked weather and stayed up late watching the moons cross the sky. Not for any reason, not for any purpose, just because the moons were there and they were beautiful, and looking at them felt like being part of something larger than himself. Curiosity, that was the word. Not courage, not defiance, not strength, curiosity. He wanted to know what the hammer felt like. He started humming. His grandmother's song, the melody without words, the sound of not being alone. He hummed it under his breath, barely audible, a vibration in his chest that had nothing to do with the hammer's hum and everything to do with being human and small and scared and alive. He reached out and put his hands on the haft. The bioluminescent veins flared, but differently than before. When the adults had touched it, the light had been sharp, aggressive, a warning pulse that said, "I see you and I am ready." Under Kale's hands, it pulsed once, slowly, almost gently, and the color shifted from harsh blue-white to something warmer, something almost amber. The hammer was confused. Kale could feel it in his palms, a tingling, a questioning, as if the weapon was reaching into him with invisible fingers, probing for the things it expected to find. Fear, aggression, the desperate need to prove, to dominate, to win. The biological imperatives that every species it had ever tested had brought to the trial like offerings laid before an altar. It found fear, yes, plenty of it, but the fear wasn't attached to anything. It wasn't driving him forward or holding him back. It was just there, like the hum of the hammer itself, background noise, acknowledged and set aside, not suppressed, not conquered, just heard, the way his mother had taught him. It found no aggression, no need to dominate, no survival instinct screaming lift or your people die, because Kale was 12 and he hadn't learned yet to carry the weight of 300 lives on his shoulders. He didn't know how to feel responsible for a colony. He didn't know how to be a hero. He was just a kid who wanted to see what would happen. The hammer searched deeper. It found a memory of Kale sitting on the workshop floor at age 6, disassembling a broken chronometer with a screwdriver too big for his hand, his tongue poking out in concentration, utterly absorbed. The whole world narrowed down to the tiny screws and springs and the mystery of how they fit together. It found the feeling of warm bread in the morning, pulled from Jin Yun's oven, steam rising, the crust cracking under Kale's fingers. It found his mother's voice reading to him, not military files but stories, old Earth stories about oceans and forests and animals that didn't exist on Thessaly, stories about a world Kale had never seen but somehow missed. It found the way the steplark sounded at dawn, and the color of the wheat at noon, and the sensation of red dirt under his fingernails, and the satisfaction of a coupling fitted just right, the small click of mechanical alignment, the pleasure of something working the way it was supposed to. It found the song, the wordless melody, still humming in his chest, 4 generations of human women passing something invisible and unbreakable from hand to hand to hand, grandmother to mother to son, outlasting wars and distances and the vast indifference of space. It found humanity, not the species, the quality. The hammer didn't know what to do with it. Kale lifted. The haft moved. A sound went through the crowd, not a gasp, not a cheer, something more primitive. A sound that 300 human throats made simultaneously, a vibration that came from somewhere deeper than language, deeper than culture, deeper than thought. A sound that the species had been making for 100,000 years, in caves and forests and fields, and now on a world at the edge of known space. The sound of witnessing something impossible. The hammer rose. It rose slowly, and Kale felt no weight at all. His arms were extended, his hands wrapped around the haft, and the 500-ton weapon was rising from its platform like it was made of air, like it was made of light, like it was made of the same substance as the song he was humming, weightless, ancient, irreducible. The bioluminescent veins were going wild, cycling through colors that human eyes had no names for, patterns racing up and down the haft in frantic, searching pulses, the weapon's bioneural mind trying to process an input it had never encountered in 10,000 years of trials across 1,000 worlds. It had tested warriors and been heavier than their rage. It had tested leaders and been heavier than their ambition. It had tested the desperate and been heavier than their desperation. It had tested the brilliant and been heavier than their calculation. It had tested the faithful and been heavier than their devotion. It had never tested a 12-year-old human boy who was lifting it not to save his people or prove his worth or defy an emperor, but because he was curious, and his mother had taught him that fear was just a signal, and he was humming a song that didn't have words, and he hadn't yet learned that some things were supposed to be impossible. The hammer cleared the platform. Cale held it above his head. The valley was silent, a silence so complete that Cale could hear the steplarks in the distant wheat, could hear the wind moving through the unburned grain, could hear his own heartbeat, steady now, calm, a rhythm that the hammer's veins were pulsing in time with, not fighting against but moving with, like two instruments playing the same note. Vrethkai had gone still. Not the stillness of composure, the stillness of a creature whose entire framework for understanding the universe had just developed a crack. His compound eyes were locked on the boy, every lens focused, every facet reflecting the impossible image. A child, undersized, unaugmented, untrained, standing in dirt-stained coveralls in the evening light of a backwater colony, holding the hammer of Vreth above his head like it was a stick he'd picked up in a field. The Varath soldiers hadn't moved. They stood in their perfect formation, weapons ready, and not one of them knew what to aim at. Their training covered combat, resistance, defiance, rebellion. It did not cover this. It did not cover a child humming a nameless song while doing something that had not been done in the entire recorded history of a galactic civilization. Nothing covered this. Cale held the hammer for 7 seconds. Later, the Varath would argue about that number. 7 seconds was nothing, a blink, a breath, a span of time so small it barely registered on their chronometric instruments. But it was also everything, because the difference between 0 and 7 was not 7, it was infinity. The hammer had been unliftable for 10,000 years. Every second it spent in the air was a revolution. Then he set it down. Not dropped it. Set it down carefully, the way you'd set down something that belonged to someone else with respect, but without reverence. He placed it back on the platform, and the bioluminescent veins slowly dimmed to their resting state, and the subsonic hum dropped to a frequency that Cale's teeth no longer registered, and the hammer sat there looking exactly as it had before, dark and massive and ancient, betraying nothing of what had just happened. He turned around and walked back to his mother. Sira caught him. She caught him the way gravity catches rain, inevitably, completely, without any possibility of missing. She went to her knees in the dirt and wrapped her arms around him, and Cale felt her shaking, and he understood that she'd been more afraid than he had, and that her fear hadn't been for the colony or the future or the abstract concept of human freedom. It had been for him, only for him. The way a mother's fear is always, in the end, only for the small, specific life she made. "You're okay," she said into his hair. "You're okay." "I'm okay, Mom." Behind them, the colony erupted. It wasn't cheering, not at first. It was that sound again, the deep communal vibration, the noise that humans make when something happens that doesn't fit inside language. Then it became voices shouting, crying, laughing, all at once. 300 people releasing a terror they'd been holding since the sky broke open. Tomás Varga was on his feet, bad shoulder forgotten, yelling something in Spanish that his grandmother had taught him, a prayer or a profanity or both, the distinction irrelevant. The Becker twins were holding each other. Maria Santos was still crying, but the tears had changed direction, same water, different gravity. Old Delgado was standing very still with his eyes closed and his lips moving, and Cale didn't know if he was praying or reciting a poem or just counting his breaths, and it didn't matter, because whatever he was doing was the same thing they were all doing, processing the fact that the world had changed shape. Pavel Orozco was the one who started it. He said the boy's name once, Cale, quietly, almost to himself. Then Jin Yun said it louder. Then the Becker twins in unison. And then they were all saying it, 300 voices in the dark, the name rising into the sky where the Varath ships hung like monuments to a certainty that had just been proven wrong. Vrethkai let the sound wash over him. He stood motionless for a long time, long enough that his soldiers began to shift, uncertain, looking to their emperor for a response that wasn't coming. Finally he moved. He walked forward, through the crowd that parted before him like water, until he stood in front of Sira and Cale. Mother and son, still holding each other, looking up at the towering figure of the emperor. Vrethkai lowered himself. It was a motion his species rarely performed, bringing the great elongated head down, folding the segmented legs, reducing himself. An act of unelevation that his attendants would later argue about for decades, debating whether it constituted acknowledgement or curiosity or something their language, like the humans, didn't have a word for. He spoke, and the translation device rendered his words in a tone stripped of everything but bewilderment. How? Kale looked at him. The compound eyes were close now, and at this distance Kale could see himself reflected in them. Hundreds of tiny Kales, each captured from a different angle, each one a boy who had done something that no one, including himself, fully understood. I don't know, Kale said, and that was the truth. Vrethkai studied him. The mandibles moved in patterns that Kale was starting to recognize as thought the Verath equivalent of a furrowed brow, a bitten lip, the visible machinery of a mind encountering something it hadn't been built to process. You felt no compulsion to dominate, no drive to prove superiority. No rage, no territorial aggression. No biological imperative to establish hierarchical dominance. I'm 12, Kale said. I just wanted to see if I could. The emperor was silent for a long time. Around them, the colonists had gone quiet again, watching this exchange between their child and the most powerful being any of them had ever stood near. The moment had the quality of a hinge, something swinging from one state to another, and everyone could feel it, the way you can feel the air change before lightning. In 10,000 years, Vrethkai said, across 1,700 worlds, the hammer of Vreth has been presented to 412 species. Warriors, conquerors, predators, hive minds, silicon sentiences, beings of pure energy, all have failed. All approached the trial as a contest of strength or will. All poured themselves against the hammer's resistance, and the hammer exceeded them, always. He paused. We designed it that way. The hammer reads biological intent and generates opposing force proportional to the intensity of that intent. The greater the will to dominate, the greater the resistance. It is the perfect filter. Any species driven primarily by the need to conquer will never lift it, because the act of wanting to conquer is precisely what makes it impossible. Then why offer it? Sira asked. She'd risen to her feet, one hand still on Kale's shoulder, and her voice had the edge of a woman who has just realized she is angry and is deciding what to do about it. Vrethkai looked at her. His compound eyes shifted, the light refracting differently, and Kale thought he detected something in the emperor's posture, the faintest suggestion of uncertainty, like a crack in a wall that had never cracked before. Because a species that can lift it is a species the Dominion cannot afford to subjugate. A species that approaches overwhelming force without the impulse to match it, that operates from curiosity rather than conquest, that carries its fear without being driven by it. Such a species is not a resource to be harvested. It is something else. What? The Emperor's bioluminescence shifted, a slow pattern, deep amber, that Kale instinctively read as something close to respect. An equal. The word landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples went out, and they didn't stop. What followed happened quickly, in the way that seismic shifts always happen quickly once they start. Vrethkai summoned his advisors from the ship, beings even larger than him, older, their exoskeletons weathered and cracked with age, their bioluminescent patterns dim but complex. They examined the recordings of the trial. They replayed from 17 angles the moment a human child had lifted the instrument of their empire's judgment. The arguments lasted through the night. Kale could hear them from Harlan's porch, not the words, which the translation devices weren't projecting, but the rhythm of Verath debate. It sounded like insects and like music, like something being taken apart and put back together in a different order. The clicking and humming rose and fell in waves, and sometimes the bioluminescent glow from inside the shuttle would flare bright enough to cast moving shadows across the commons, and then dim again, as if the debate itself had a pulse. The colony didn't sleep either. People sat on their porches, gathered in small groups in the spaces between homesteads, talked in low voices. Some held their children, some held each other. The Yun family made pot after pot of tea and carried it around the settlement, not because anyone had asked, but because that was what you did. When the world changed shape and you didn't know what the new shape would be, you made tea and you brought it to people, and you sat with them and you waited. Sira came to check on Kale twice. The first time she brought the blanket and the stew and sat with him for a while, not talking, just being near. The second time she brought a piece of the honey cake that Renata had baked 3 days ago for Tomaz's birthday. The celebration had been postponed when the sky broke open, but the cake was still good, and Sira gave Kale the corner piece with the most frosting because she always gave him the corner piece, even when he told her he didn't need it. "You should sleep," she said the second time. "I can't." "I know. Neither can I." She pushed his hair back from his forehead, a gesture from when he was small, automatic, the kind of touch that parents do without thinking, because the body remembers even when the mind moves on. "I'm proud of you. You know that." "I know, Mom." She left to coordinate with the other settlement leaders. There were things to plan, contingencies to prepare for, the practical work of a colony that had just been given a future it hadn't expected to have. Kale watched her walk across the commons, straight-backed and purposeful, and loved her with the uncomplicated ferocity of a 12-year-old, who has only recently begun to understand that his mother is a person with a life that started before he existed, and who is still, at 12, a long way from understanding what that means. Kale sat on the porch of Harlan's workshop, wrapped in his blanket, eating a bowl of the stew that Jin Yun had made from the last of the winter stores. The stew was good, thick, peppery, with chunks of the tuber that grew wild in the valley's eastern slopes and a flavor that was halfway between potato and chestnut. Kale ate it slowly, letting the warmth of the bowl seep into his hands, watching the lights move inside the Verath shuttle. Harlan sat beside him, oiling a piece of equipment that didn't need oiling, the way he did when he needed his hands busy and his mind somewhere else. "You know," Harlan said after a while, "I fought the Verath at Verada Minor, 17 years ago, worst 48 hours of my life." Kale looked at him. Harlan didn't talk about the war, ever. It was the thing everyone in the colony knew and no one mentioned, like a scar you didn't stare at. "We lost," Harlan continued. "Obviously, outgunned, outmaneuvered, out-everything. Our equipment was a generation behind theirs. Our tactics were a joke. We threw everything we had at them and it was like throwing pebbles at a mountain." He paused, hands still moving on the equipment. But there was this one moment. He was quiet long enough that Kale thought he might not continue. Then he did. "We were pinned in a ravine. 8 of us left out of 60. Comms down, no evac, no support. Verath patrol coming in from the east and we could hear them, that clicking sound their armor makes, like something counting down. We had maybe 20 minutes. He set down the equipment, looked at his hands. And Corporal Tanaka, she was 24, I think, maybe 25, from some island on Earth I'd never heard of, she pulled out a harmonica. Right there in the ravine, with the enemy closing in, she pulled out this dented little harmonica and started playing. Some song I didn't know. Something slow and sad, and completely inappropriate for the situation. "Why?" I asked her the same thing. You know what she said? Harlan's voice had changed, softer, younger, the voice of the man he'd been before the war erased him and Thessaly rebuilt him. She said she didn't want the last sound she heard to be clicking. They sat with that for a moment. The steplarks had come back. They always came back at night, roosting in the wheat with their small, fierce calls, and their songs rose from the field in the dark, undisturbed by empire or judgment or the politics of civilizations. "That's what you did today," Harlan said. You played the harmonica. I don't play harmonica. Harlan looked at him, and his eyes were wet, and he was smiling the same half-smile he'd used before walking to the hammer. The one that said this is going to hurt, and I'm going to do it anyway. You hummed, he said, same thing. Cale wasn't sure he understood, but he thought he might someday. The dawn came in shades of amber and violet, the two colors bleeding into each other at the horizon like watercolors running on wet paper. Thessaly IV's dawn was different from Earth's. Cale had never seen an Earth dawn, but his mother had described them, and she said Earth dawns were slower, softer, filtered through an atmosphere that had been seasoned by 4 billion years of life. Thessaly's dawn was sharper, newer, the light of a young sun hitting a young atmosphere, everything crisp and clean and slightly too bright, like a note played on a string that hadn't been broken in yet. The steplarks were already singing. They always started before the light, tuning up in the dark like an orchestra warming before the conductor arrives. Cale could identify 6 different call patterns. He'd been cataloging them for 2 years, filling a notebook with his observations, not because anyone had asked, but because the larks were there and they were singing, and the patterns were beautiful, and he wanted to understand them. The Verath shuttle's glow dimmed as the natural light strengthened, and the clicking sounds of debate slowed and then stopped, and Vrethkai emerged into the morning with his advisors behind him. Vrethkai stood before the assembled colonists in the light of the new day, and his bearing had changed. Not softened, the Verath didn't soften, any more than stone softens, but shifted, recalibrated. The geometry of his posture had altered in ways that the humans couldn't consciously read but unconsciously felt. He was no longer standing over them. He was standing with them. It was a subtle difference, the difference between a wall and a door, but it changed the shape of everything. The Dominion Council has reviewed the trial, he said. The results are unprecedented. Protocol requires that we classify your species according to the outcome. The colonists held their breath. 300 people, one breath held. Humanity is granted the status of honored vassal. A murmur went through the crowd, but Vrethkai raised one segmented arm, and the murmur died. However, the council is recommending a classification revision, not honored vassal, a new category, the first new category in 6,000 years. He paused, and something happened to his compound eyes, a shift in the way they refracted the morning light, a change that Cale, who had been watching the Verath closely for hours now, interpreted as the closest thing they had to vulnerability. In 10,000 years, the hammer has never been lifted. Our entire system of classification, vassal, labor, resource, honored, was built on the assumption that it never would be. That assumption has been invalidated. The system must change. He turned to Sira. Your son did not lift the hammer through strength or will or defiance or any quality the Dominion has previously measured. He lifted it through something we do not have a classification for. Our scholars are calling it neutral engagement, the ability to interact with an overwhelming force without either submitting to it or opposing it, to simply be present with it, to be curious about it, to hum while holding it. He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had weight. We have encountered 412 species. Not one of them has demonstrated this capacity. They fight or they submit. They conquer or they serve. The binary is so consistent across the galaxy that we built our entire civilization on the assumption that it was universal. That sentience, by its nature, expresses itself through dominance or deference, that there is no third option. His gaze found Cale. Your child broke a 10,000-year-old assumption by being too young to know it existed. The colonists were utterly still. Even the steplarks had gone quiet, as if the planet itself was listening, as if the soil and the wheat and the wide amber sky had all leaned in to hear what would be said next. Sira spoke. Her voice was steady, but Cale could see her hands clenched at her sides, the knuckles white, the tendons standing out. The hands of a woman who has been afraid for a very long time, and is only now allowing herself to consider the possibility that she doesn't have to be. What does the new classification mean, practically? It means we don't know what to do with you, Vrethkai said. And for the first time, his translation device rendered something that sounded almost, impossibly, like a laugh. A sound so unexpected that several colonists flinched. It means that the Dominion Council will need to convene a full session, the first in 300 years, to determine how to integrate a species that does not fit the binary. It means your people will not be subjugated, because subjugation requires a predictable response, and you are not predictable. It means your colony will not be harvested, because harvesting requires a resource, and you are not a resource. He straightened to his full height, all 3.5 meters of him, the ancient exoskeleton catching the morning light, the bioluminescent veins pulsing in slow, thoughtful amber. It also means that I will be recommending to the Council that the hammer trial be permanently retired. It was designed to identify species worthy of respect by testing them against an impossible challenge. Your child has demonstrated that the challenge was never impossible. It was merely posed to the wrong kind of mind. For 10,000 years, we have been asking the wrong question. What's the right question? Kale asked. Vrethkai looked at him. The compound eyes held him from 1,000 angles, and in every one of those fractured reflections, Kale saw himself, small, dirty, 12 years old, standing in the morning light of a world that had not been conquered. We haven't determined that yet, the Emperor said. Perhaps you will help us find it. He turned to leave, and then stopped. His body went still in that particular Verath way, total cessation of motion, every segment locked, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. The boy, he said, not turning back, what is his name? Kale, Sira said. The Emperor's bioluminescence flared once, amber, deep and warm, and his mandibles clicked in a pattern that Kale would later learn was the Verath equivalent of committing something to permanent memory. Not writing it down, encoding it, making it part of the bioneural architecture of the self, so that it could not be forgotten even if forgetting were desired. Kale, the Emperor repeated, and the word sounded different in his mouth, heavier, older, as if by saying it he was entering it into a record that spanned millennia and would span millennia more. Then he walked back to his shuttle, and his soldiers followed, and the attendants carried the hammer, the great, dark, humming weapon that had defined the fate of 1,000 worlds, back into the ship with a care that looked almost like mourning. Like they were carrying something that had died, though it had never been alive, though it had only ever been a question, and the question had finally been answered, and the answer had broken it. The shuttle lifted. The ships above began to move, the shadow retreating from the valley like a tide going out. The sunlight returned, not gradually but all at once, the way it does when the last cloud passes, a sudden flood of warmth and color that made the colonists blink and shade their eyes and then lower their hands and stand in it, just stand in it, feeling it on their skin. The wheat, what was left of it, the unburned wheat that still stood golden and patient in the fields, caught the light and held it, and for a moment the whole valley looked like it was on fire with something that wasn't fire, something that didn't consume, something that grew. Kale stood in the commons, watching the ships diminish into the sky, 12 dark shapes getting smaller and smaller until they were stars, and then until they weren't even that. His mother stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her grip no longer iron but open, resting. Harlan stood behind them both, and his bad knee was aching. It always ached in the morning, but he was standing, which was enough. 300 colonists of Thessaly IV stood in the morning light of a world that had not been conquered, and the steplarks sang their small, fierce songs, and the wheat that had not been burned was golden, and the sky above them was clear. Later, there would be consequences. The Dominion Council would convene. Ambassadors would be sent, first Verath, then human, then both together, learning to speak a language that neither species had ever needed before. Treaties would be drafted. Humanity's place in a galactic order designed for warriors and servants would need to be defined by people far more important than a 12-year-old boy and his mother and an old veteran with a bad knee. But that was later. That was politics and protocol, and the slow machinery of civilization, adjusting to an unexpected input. Now there was just the morning, the wheat, the larks, a boy who had lifted something impossible because he didn't know it was impossible, and a mother who had let him try because she understood, had always understood, from the moment she felt him kick inside her for the first time, small and fierce and relentlessly curious, that the most human thing you could do was reach for something without knowing whether you could hold it. "Mom," Kale said. "Yeah. Can I have more of Jin's stew?" Sierra laughed. It was a sound like the larks, like the wheat catching light, like a coupling fitted just right, small, specific, irreplaceable. The kind of sound that no bioneural weapon could measure, that no classification system could contain, that no empire, however vast, however old, however certain of its own supremacy, could ever conquer. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, you can have more stew." They walked home together through the wheat, and the sky above them was open and wide, and full of the kind of light that doesn't come from any sun. The light that comes from the space a shadow leaves behind when it decides, against all precedent and expectation, to move. Behind them in the commons, the scorched circle where the shuttle had landed was already disappearing under the morning dew. By next season, wheat would grow there too. It always did. That was the thing about wheat, and about humans, and about small fierce lives on the edge of everything. They grew back.